I do not cease to give thanks for you, that you may know the hope which God calls you to. Amen. Did widespread fraud affect the outcome of the recent presidential election? Americans can't seem to agree about this. We fear fake news. We worry that untrue stories manipulate us and that they sink so deeply into our consciousness that we become strangers to our former selves, alienated from what is real, in the slavery of the powers of darkness. Isn't it strange that even the expression fake news has become itself another layer of deception? It cuts us off from trusting any relatively objective or authoritative news source. And so these days, we feel cut adrift, almost overwhelmed by a strange dislocation and separation from truth. It reminds me of the way Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote that capitalism undermines its own foundations and creates conditions of what they call everlasting uncertainty. In the Communist Manifesto, they write, "All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." End quote. What exactly are the real conditions of life? Today in America, we have an equally serious problem with fake religion. The 20th century theologian Karl Barth used the word religion pejoratively, so it was a term of approbation. For him, it meant the abstract and the self-serving images that are just ways of protecting our own self. He contrasts religion like that with what he called the message of Jesus. Jesus reveals who God really is. Jesus, who gives himself completely for our sake, who gives up his whole life so that we may have life, inspire us to know how to care for others. So fake religion is tribalistic. It focuses on us versus them, on who is saved and who is not. It is obsessed with believing the right things, or at least saying that you're believing the right things. And it talks more about vague interior spiritual states than actually caring for the poor or welcoming those who are strangers. Forms of fake religion these days seem especially engrossed by the issue of abortion, which is not mentioned in the Bible. And these forces have raised the stakes in elections so that mere differences of opinion simply cannot be tolerated. And opposing politicians become demonized as the enemy. Fake news and fake religion are not disconnected from our understanding of what human nature is like, what it means to be human. You may remember this story. A group of English schoolboys are the only survivors of a plane crash in the Pacific, and they arrive on a deserted island, and one boy named Ralph becomes the leader, and he sets up rules like how to tend the signal fire so that they might be rescued. And another boy just becomes fascinated with hunting pigs, and his name is Jack. And he leads a kind of rebellion that results in brutal hazing and in the death of other boys. When the British naval officer comes ashore to survey the island that is now laid waste, he feels surprised. He says, quote, "I should have thought that a pack of British boys would have been able to put up a better show than that." And Ralph, the leader, weeps, quote, "for the end of innocence and for the darkness of man's heart." Of course, none of this really happened. It is the plot of William Golding's 1951 novel, The Lord of the Flies. It sold tens of millions of copies, was translated into dozens and dozens of languages, and is a staple in a high school curriculum as a kind of classic. Some people admire it for its realistic depiction of human nature and what happens when human instincts are no longer held in check by civilization. But is this how people really are? Was the philosopher Thomas Hobbes right to say that outside of civilization, life was nasty, brutish, and short, a kind of war of all against all? William Golding seemed to believe that this was true, but he was a pretty unhappy person. He struggled with alcoholism. He was famous in his classes for setting teams of boys against each other. And he even said at one point, quote, "I have always understood the Nazis because I am of that sort of nature." Strangely, it turns out that there is an actual real-life version of the Lord of the Flies that played itself out in beginning of June of 1965. A group of 6 boys between the ages of 13 and 16 who were students at an Anglican boys' school in Nuku'alofa, Tonga, became bored with their studies, and so they took a fishing boat out late at night through the harbor. And their first mistake was that they all fell asleep at the wheel, and when they woke up, a terrible storm had come upon them. And so the storm ripped their sail to shreds, it wrecked the rudder, and for 8 days, they were cut adrift and sharing what little food and water they had. And then they spotted it, little more than a rock. It was called Ata Island. And so that's where they lived. And a year and a half later, or a year and 3 months later, a captain discovered the boys there. And their story almost could not be more different from the story of William Golding's. Their rescuer said, quote, "By the time we arrived, the boys had set up a small commune with a food garden, hollowed out tree trunks to store rainwater, a gymnasium with curious weights, a badminton court, chicken pens, and a permanent fire, all from handiwork, an old knife blade, and much determination." The boys agreed to work in teams of 2 and set up a rota of different tasks: guard duty, kitchen duty, working in the garden. They resolved quarrels by imposing a kind of timeout. So one boy would go to one end of the island, the other would go to the other, and then they'd apologize. Quote, "That's how we stayed friends," one said afterwards. They started and ended their days with song and prayer. What if human beings are better than we think they are? What would that mean as we tried to distinguish fake religion from true faith? I think Jesus shows us exactly this in the last days of his public ministry. When Karl Barth was a young man, he wrote that the gospel is not a truth among other truths. Rather, it sets up a question mark for all truths. This morning, Jesus sets up a question mark against fake religion. In the last day of Jesus' of public ministry, he tells 3 parables, which are not so much about the kingdom of God or something that's going to happen far off in the future, but about how we should live right now. The first is the parable of bridesmaids who do not bring enough oil and have to go to the market to buy more, and they end up missing the celebration. It encourages us to live mindfully and joyfully. The second parable is the story of a rich man going out of town, and he leaves different amounts of money with different of his servants, and 2 of the servants get more money, and one buries it and hides it. And this story is about the importance of living a daring and fruitful life. And finally, we have today's story about the sheep and the goats. It encourages us to live compassionately and as generously as we can. And we have this final parable on the final day of the church, final Sunday of the church year. And it's our last message from Matthew, who we've been following through this entire church year. The Son of Man in glory has the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. And he welcomes the sheep, saying, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. He said, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was in prison, you came to visit me. And the goats are cursed because they did not do this. Now, my main point today is that this is not a message of condemnation or threat from Jesus. Jesus is not trying to scare us into doing more to help other people. Instead, he shows us two things. First, Jesus declares his solidarity with all people who are suffering. When we are in our darkest hour, in whatever way, when we are feeling naked and confined and hungry and thirsty, that is when Jesus is with us most powerfully. Second, Jesus unveils who we really are. Our nature is not as warriors or belligerents in a war of all against all. We are made for and fulfilled by goodness. In short, I have met all sorts of people, good ones and bad ones, but I've never in my life met a thoroughgoing goat. We have all, to various extents, fed, welcomed, and visited each other. In this parable, we are not the goats, but also we are not the sheep. The sheep say, when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you? And Jesus replies, just as you did it to the most insignificant of my brothers, you did it to me. In short, we are not the sheep because we now know that when we encounter someone in need, that is the king in disguise. So in that way, we stand outside of this parable. But that doesn't mean we can't still learn from it. Before COVID, 40 million Americans were classified as food insecure. And since then, the number has risen to over 70 million. There are 3 times as many households with children who are food insecure now as there were before. The food pantry in the middle school in my neighborhood has lines stretching around the block. In this time when the stakes are so high, it is more important than ever to recognize fake religion. In the last days of his teaching, Jesus shows us that it matters what you believe or how you pray or what signs of the Spirit you might feel. But far more important is what you do to help the others who are around you. This morning, Jesus presents us with a kind of agenda for Christianity, the program of generosity and kindness which fulfills our true nature and draws us more deeply into the mystery of God. I have only one more thing, and I'm tempted not to share it because I don't know how much I've been talking for a little bit longer than I usually do. But in an article she published this week, the novelist Marilynne Robinson writes an article about how she has changed as a Christian. And she writes about the moving beyond the dominant and false language that we inherit of rationality, beyond the sense of consciousness that comes along with that. She said that instead of seeing our unconscious life as, in a Freudian way, as a matter of sexual drives, or rather than seeing it as an economic way, as our internal self is guided by greed, she says instead, how we can appreciate that part of us which rejoices when we perceive something new, that wonder that children experience and that we see so much in them. In her last sentence, she writes, I believe also that it is among our strange privilege as human beings to have an important ability to decide what in our minds we choose to attend to, and therefore what our lives will be. What will we attend to? While I would not call it everlasting uncertainty, we do not perfectly understand ourselves. But there is vastly more to us than merely fear of others. Do not be misled by fake news or fake religion. Remember, in the real Lord of the Flies, the boys prayed and sang together at the beginning and end of every day. See Jesus all around you. Hold on to his promise that God is present in everything you do for the sake of love and mercy. Amen.